Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, why the best writers risk being strange. And today I've got back to the show Christian Bok, who we're going to talk to about his Xenotext project. Because Christian, unlike all writers in human history, has realized the dream of creating an immortal poem. So can you tell us just a little bit, Christian, about what the Xenotext is and what I mean by that?
The Xenotext is a work of art that has taken about 25 years to complete, in part because the task is Herculean, if not Sisyphean in its duresses. Very hard project I embarked upon about 25 years ago. The project requires me to write two very short poems. The first is written in such a way that I can translate it into a sequence of genetic nucleotides. And then with the assistance of a laboratory, we build that gene in the lab, implanting my translated poem into the genome of a bacterium, replacing part of its genetic code with my poem, so that the organism, in effect, becomes a work of living poetry. Moreover, the organism can then subsequently read this gene sequence. It reads my poem, understands it as a set of instructions, and in response, builds a protein. Now, a protein is nothing more than a long sequence of amino acids, and this sequence of molecules enciphers a totally different poem that also makes sense and speaks back to mine. So in effect, I've genetically engineered a bacterium so that it can become not only an archive for storing my poem, but it also becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And in effect, I've written a poem that can literally change the behavior of a living thing. Now, to add to the weirdness of this project, I've selected as the host for this exercise an unkillable bacterium, a deathless microbe called Deinococcus radiodurans. It's a very ancient organism, an extremophile, meaning that it can enjoy all kinds of environments in which to live. Any inhospitable environment imaginable, it can probably survive. You can scorch it, freeze it, wither it, and it won't die. It can repair its own DNA when it's damaged so quickly that it doesn't mutate or change. It doesn't adapt or evolve. But it is already so well adapted to the utter lethality of the universe that it doesn't need to change. It can survive 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that would instantly kill you. It can even survive in the open vacuum of outer space. We don't know what its natural habitat is. We can find it in almost any environment on Earth. We don't know how it really would have acquired all of these immunities. There is no environment on Earth that would drive its evolution into this particular niche. But by putting my poem into this particular bacterium, I would effectively be writing a book that could conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization and be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. So I've in effect written a book that could last forever. And it just so happens that the poems I've written pertain to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. The first poem is written in the voice of Orpheus and makes some elaborate claims about the power of poetry to imbue things with life. And the organism reads this poem, and in response, it writes one in the voice of Eurydice, which tends to refute this claim and remarks upon the power of poetry only to grieve the loss of life. It has no power to bring life into existence, but merely has the power to mourn its loss. And these two works are in dialogue with each other, and they get to survive, I guess, in this infernal grimoire, for all time. It's probably the most stringently constrained poem ever written in the history of literature. I think the only poem that might come close to it in terms of the number of restrictions upon it is a work called The Star Gauge by a Chinese poet named Xu He, a very ancient poem that is possibly rivals mine in its degree of complexity. This is undoubtedly the hardest thing I've ever had to embark upon doing, and I'm grateful now that it's over, that I managed finally to succeed at doing it, because the odds against successfully completing it are pretty cosmic in scale. It's really a truly difficult thing I embarked upon doing. And the fact that I managed to pull it off is, I think, akin to miraculous. I'm very lucky that I managed to figure out how to do it. So that, in a nutshell, I guess in the course of 4 or 5 minutes, is what the poem is about.
Now, I think that sometimes people, when they hear this concept and so on, um, I think they can have a hard time understanding what is difficult about it. And so one thing that is more difficult than I think a lot of people understand is actually writing the two poems in and of itself. The encipherment itself, put aside all the genetic components, putting it into bacteria and so on. Just the encipherment of the two poems in this manner is more difficult than many people think, because I think when I first met you, you were sort of partly into this project, but you weren't that far along in it, relatively speaking. And when I interviewed you back then for The Believer, and we were talking about this project, one of the things you had done was you likened the writing of the two poems to a cryptogram or a crypto quote.
Yes.
That you might do in the newspaper, and which I think, in some ways is a good metaphor for kind of the process on a certain level. But of course, you're doing a much more stringent thing. Can you just talk on the language level of what are some of the difficulties of actually constructing two poems in this manner?
Now, the two poems are short, and they have to be written in a way that's mutually referential in order for them to actually be encipherable into the bacterium. They have this particular property to them about a kind of mutual encipherment. And I've tried to explain it metaphorically to people that, the difficulty of doing it. It's tantamount to imagining solving a cryptogram in a Sunday newspaper. You occasionally see a message that might be an encoded puzzle. And if you analyze the letter frequencies and letter patterns using some logic and reasoning, you could perhaps assign letters to those given to you in the encoded message, and decipher this otherwise nonsensical string of letters into something that's intelligible and makes sense. Now, as a young kid solving these puzzles, I used to wonder why the puzzle designers didn't actually give us an intelligible message first. One, that if we analyzed its letter patterns and letter frequencies, we could then decipher into another intelligible message that would also make sense. Wouldn't it be great to be able to have an encoded message that actually makes sense, and as a consequence would be the perfect disguise? You wouldn't know that it enciphers a totally different message that is in fact the intended one. And you might, for that reason, let it pass. But obviously, any nonsensical message you might get, you'd say, oh, that's obviously, enciphered. It's in code. I better pay attention closely to it. Now, I know why no puzzle designer has actually accomplished this task. As it turns out, it's very, very difficult. Imagine assigning assigning letters to the alphabet such that they're mutually encoded. So if I assign A to T, I have to assign T to A. If I assign H to N, I have to assign N to H. If I assign E to Y, I have to assign Y to E. We pair off all the letters of the alphabet so that they have this mutually correlated relationship with each other. Now, that's a smaller subset of all the possible ways in which you can encipher the alphabet. But the number of ways that you can do that is a little less than 8 trillion. It's a very large number. So I would ask you then, okay, let's say we have that repertoire of ciphers at our disposal. Pick one, through a set of heuristics, rules of thumb, some good guesses. Pick one in such a way that you could imagine writing a poem that makes perfect sense and is beautiful, such that you could replace all the letters in it with the cognate letters from your cipher, and the result would be no less beautiful and make perfect sense. I embarked upon that task because it was the first step in this project, or this was the first thing I had to figure out how to do. And it turns out that it's effectively impossible. Out of the 8 trillion available ciphers, not many are actually capable of producing very large vocabularies. The largest I could find was a little less than 700 words. And even that one was insufficient for solving this particular problem. And I worked my way through smaller and smaller vocabularies that I searched out, designed a piece of software that allowed me to come up with ciphers, find all the words in the language that followed this particular constraint, and then see if it was possible to say anything meaningful or useful. And as it turns out, it's impossible. There are no available outcomes to this particular problem. I spent 4 years working on this particular task and nothing else. 4 years of effort
Yes.
exploring the 8 trillion possibilities. And as it turns out, there's only one that permits you to write anything meaningful that has any poetic merit at all. And it just so happens that it is this dialogue between Orpheus and Eurydice. There's nothing else you can say that works. Some computer scientists, doubtful about my admonitions here, tried to brute force the problem and quickly discovered that I was entirely truthful. It really is impossible, and that there is probably no other alternative other than the one that I managed to find. This is the most optimal outcome. Very, very challenging problem. And to me, the number 8 trillion to 1 is kind of cosmic in scale. There's about maybe 8 trillion exoplanets in our galaxy. And so far as we can tell, there's no life on any of them. They're all deserts, at least at first glance. And it seems to me a surprise, right, that there's only one way to do this particular problem. There's only in our galaxy, there's only one planet that bears life and has any poetry at all. And the fact that in this constraint you have a similar kind of odd, against the existence of the poem, and yet here it is, and it says something useful and meaningful and kind of wonderful. I think it reflects something upon the rarity of life in the cosmos, rarity of poetry, in the universe itself. Even though these poems aren't something I would normally attempt to pursue, I think they have a fragility to them that is represented by the fact that they are the only possible outcome of this particular constraint.
And just to kind of put a bit of extra historical context in there, I remember when I was a student in the PhD program in Calgary and you were a professor there, you were constantly engaged in this process to where you'd have this computer program that you designed or built or whatever that would start basically you would utilize it to try to figure out correct me if I'm wrong, but you'd utilize it to try to figure out what are the available lexicons. Like, so if A is E and L is R or whatever, you'd go through it like this and figure out what would be the words that I could have. And it would take, I don't know how long, hours or days to spit out this answer. And then you'd have to try to write with it. And then, of course, you'd fail. And you'd have to do it again. And so before we kind of get a little deeper into the process and the problem in the poems, can you talk a little bit about why was it that you didn't quit and move on to a new project? Because at a certain point, as you say, I can't imagine how frustrating it was. Maybe it was also fun, but at a certain point, as you say, it begins to seem impossible.
Yeah, I really thought that this was the hardest part of the task. I thought being able to generate these 2 poems would be the primary hurdle. Now, when I got the idea for doing this, I thought the idea was too good not to try. I really wanted to be able to demonstrate the power of the idea. I started work on this in 2002, shortly after I published my book, Eunoia. And that work was written according to a Herculean constraint. It was very difficult to produce. It took 7 years to write it. There was a lot of misery involved in producing it. It was very unpleasant to work on it. But it went on to become a globally renowned bestseller. It won the biggest prize in the world for poetry and established my career for the better part of a decade. Became a talismanic work in the history of Canadian literature. And of course, it afforded me, permission, I think, to try to do something even more ambitious. And so I embarked upon this task, thinking that I had to find a way to upstage that prior work, right? To do something even more difficult, perhaps, something that would test my aptitudes more stringently, something that would impress people who, are going to be predisposed to see me fail at something. And I wanted to write a book that could conceivably persist in a living thing. Nobody's ever done that before. Wanted to see if it was truly possible to actually engage in this dialogue with the genetic code. Surely, that would be an immense contribution to 21st century literature, right? To write a poem that could conceivably outlast the sun. So there were heavy payoffs here, and big risks. But I'm the poet who's got a reputation for doing impossible things. I wanted to live up to that reputation, and as a consequence, was very diligent and bloody-minded about solving this problem. I had a lot of faith that the language would find a way to figure out this problem, that there was some avenue or path to success, despite all the evidence to the contrary.
Why do you think you're so ambitious? Why do you think you have that ambition, whereas many people don't? In fact, I was go as far as to say that ambition is become gone out of fashion.
Sure. Um, well, I come from a working class family. I've, been raised in poverty. I've, had a tough upbringing, and I suppose I'm doing my best to live up to the aptitudes I'm supposed to have. I didn't want to be confined or constrained by the background, and I've worked hard, I suppose, to earn a place in the pantheon of modern poetry. I didn't want to be forgotten or neglected. And, you have to, I think, take a risk, invest heavily in a large scale task in order to make a difference in the world. Poetry is, it's a difficult art form in which to actually make a difference. Despite, the low cost of entry and the low cost of failure, it, I think, is also nevertheless really challenging to offer something new. I mean, it used to be that poetry founded civilizations, right? I mean, it was the repository for our civilization. I mean, I don't think you can actually found a civilization without the benefit of the memorial characteristics of epic poetry. Every religion, is founded on, an infernal grimoire of poetry, right? Every major civilization has had to, at least at first, preserve its heritage in works of art like poetry. So it's an immensely important, kind of powerful medium for expressing, large scale human condition, especially at, the epic scope of our condition. It's of course not favorable right now to do that. There's an immense long-term lyric turn in poetry. We don't use it to memorialize our epic concerns, and I suspect probably to our disadvantage now. It might be important at this point in human development to revisit that particular set of biases and reassess them. And as a consequence, I just thought I wanted to be a poet that was suited to the 21st century. I wanted to respond to the socio-technological circumstances of my time. And in some respects, that means, speaking to science. It's not the only thing that you could do. Of course, there's lots of ways in which a person can be a poet today and make a difference. But that one seemed to me an important affordance. Science is probably the most important thing that we do as a species. That's probably the most important cultural activity that we do, second only maybe to the economy. I mean, we have to get the science right if we want to guarantee our long-term survival. It's going to be very challenging, right? If we screw it up, right, we're really going to make a mess of ourselves. And I wanted to be sure that whatever happens in that maybe poetry has a place, within it, says something important, with respect to it.
Connected to this is one of the things that I always think is so interesting and eerie about the poem or the project, I suppose, as a whole, is that kind of somewhat impossible. Like, it really is one of the few poems. Interestingly, you're not necessarily approaching it in this way. You're approaching it, as you say, almost scientifically speaking, and with this analytic rigor and workmanlike, craftsmanlike approach. Yet you somehow, strangely, even against your will, end up in this bizarre space where it's as if the muse tells you what you can and cannot write. There's one thing you can write, it's this thing, and nothing else will satisfy the parameters of this project. It's almost weirdly as if you're this conduit for the language. And when you were first kind of explaining to me all the Herculeans, how it had become even a harder project than you had thought by the end of it when you started out, one of the things that I jokingly said to you was, "Does this poem prove that we're in the Matrix? Is it as if it was there already and you had found it
Well,
in a weird sort of way?" So, of course, that's a ridiculous question on some level, but I'm curious to know, like,
no, it's not.
can you find that?
Part of the power of the work, at least for me, is derives from its spookiness, from the uncanniness of it. That it's not so much that I've written it as though I've discovered it, right? I've found it embedded within these constraints. It's immanent within the constraint itself. What adds, of course, to the weirdness of it is not just that I have this arbitrary set of rules about the mutually correlated relationship between the two poems that I have to kind of overcome in order for me to even begin designing the poem so it's suited to the biological context within which it's got to be written. I have to solve this problem first, and before I can even entertain genetically engineering it. And I had assumed that having solved that problem, then the act of engineering it would be a relatively straightforward technical task that wouldn't require anything more than resources and money to accomplish. But as it turns out, to do this task addresses one of the most difficult problems in the history of biology. I have to be able to design this genetic structure in such a way that it produces a viable protein that won't harm the cell, will actually persist long enough for it to be detectable and characterizable so that we can study it or analyze it, but can be metabolized by the cell, that it won't be regarded as kind of a foreign element that needs to be destroyed instantaneously, that the genetic sequence won't be regarded as some sort of viral contaminant that is subsequently, changed or, altered by the organism. Has to be able to transcend all of those problems, and has to create this protein that's capable of folding into a coherent form. And the odds of being able to do it for a sequence of amino acids of this particular length, even though in the grand scheme of proteins, it's not that long. It's 140 amino acids long, which is relatively short. It's substantive though, and it's actually lengthy for the purposes of this task. To get all of the molecules lined up, so to speak, in a manner which makes it possible for that protein to fold, the odds of that occurring are infinitesimally disfavoring me. The raw odds are 1 in 150 novum quinquagentillion, which is a 1 followed by 182 zeros. There's nothing in the cosmos that you could count, really, that equals that number. That number is so titanic as to beggar the imagination. And that's the haystack in which I have to find this one needle. And that turned out to be the hardest part of the task. I thought finishing the poem, which I think was around 2012, I managed to solve that particular problem. It took me 10 years to figure out how to get to that point. And I thought the rest would be sooner.
Why is it? Why is it that you were wrong in that sense? Why did you think it would be easier? Like, were you just not doing the math at that point, or were you not aware
No,
of something you even aware of?
I embarked upon the task, having to learn all of the genetic engineering and proteomic engineering myself. I had to acquire all of those skills. I had to also teach myself sufficient computer programming to be able to design the tools for this task. I couldn't just delegate these things to scientists. They have other better things to do. They have to solve, harder problems. They're trying to cure cancer. And if I'm going to show up, right, I can't simply ask them to design things for me and solve problems. The best I can ask them to do is to make things for me and to test things for me, which they were more, inclined to do. But if I, ran into a problem, it was my responsibility to solve it. If there was difficulties in the design, it was my responsibility to figure all of that out on my own. I could consult with them, but I couldn't ask them to do stuff like that for me. So, I had to go in at the start of the exercise without any of that training. So it required at least 4 years of research just to get to the point where I felt confident enough that I could start asking people questions of the sort required to solve these problems. If let alone asking for money, like I have to be able to be a credible applicant for funding, and I have to be able to convince scientists that I would be a good partner, that I would be capable of leading a team of scientists, and all of that requires demonstrating expertise. Even before I've opened the book. So it was a challenge to get to that point. I thought that surely getting to that point would be most of the task, and then figuring out how to write these two poems. They're very difficult. Turned out to be much harder than I anticipated. I assumed that because the repertoire of available options was so large that I would have room to explore, and I would be able to find things that I could weigh. I could look at a diverse variety of things, and writing poetry would not be so hard. But as it turns out, the odds against it are immense. It was really impossible. So when you overcome one impossible thing, you assume that surely the road will be opened afterwards, right? That you must be walking down a street where the street lights will turn on as you walk down the street. And it turns out no. Now you've graduated to a harder video game level here, right? The task is now even subsequently harder. To be able to design a protein so that it could fold, no scientist knew how to do that. There was no tools at our disposal. There was a lot of good ways to guess. I could make some very educated guesses about how to build things. I could borrow some time on supercomputers. I could learn as much as I did. I mean, I learned as much as I could about how to design a protein so that it would fold properly. But that was regarded as probably the hardest problem in biology. And I was able to narrow down to a handful of options to try. I could do an experiment, but the cost of those experiments is very high, it's really, really expensive, and time consuming and difficult, requires many resources. So I had to get it right early on. I couldn't just simply try and try again. I was very limited in the number of chances I was going to be given, right? I didn't have many opportunities to try. So this is what made it especially challenging, is that I couldn't just show up and say, look, I have 100 things I'd like to try. Can one of them will work?
Hold my poll for me, guys.
Yeah. No, it's I had to come up with a well-reasoned argument for why this particular protein had the pertinent characteristics that might permit it to fold properly and produce an outcome that was viable. And as it turns out, in exploring the possibilities, would prune this tree very quickly. And it got to the point after doing a few dozen experiments that I had run out of options. That it was very unlikely I was going to find a solution to this particular problem. It was looking very, very unlikely to be able to get it to work in the host organism. It might just be impossible. I was getting to the point of thinking I may have embarked on something that after 20 some odd years might not work at all, that there was actually no path to success. You whittle away the various paths in the labyrinth, the kind of decision tree, start pruning the branches on it. You pursue one path, and you discover that's a dead end. You cut off all of the, descendant paths from that one and try the alternatives. But I was running out of alternative paths. I was getting down to the really twiggy bits on this decision tree. And fortunately, managed to find the one, and there's probably only one solution out of that number, 150 novum quinquagentillion possibilities. I think I found the only one. Getting people, on board to build the thing, to test it, that was an immense amount of, difficulty. I went through at least 3 or 4 partnerships with corporations and laboratories, long-term, collaborations. Many of which did not, result in success. And then I would have to go again. I have to do it all over again. You get the failure, try again with new group of people, remuster resources, call upon help and favors to get it to work. Really challenging, and doing it all without the support of peers, which is very infuriating, right? To try and get funding or grants, and be turned down in peer review by your fellow poets or your fellow artists. If you show up and you say, look, I'm trying to build a poem that will outlast the sun, and your peers are saying, "No, screw you. We're not going to let you do that." Very,
Now,
very discouraging experience.
now that you've done it, it's worth pointing out to people who may not know that not only has Christian actually completed this project and the poem lives, uh, but it's not just in an underground bunker locked away in a case. You also have published a book, and people can go find the book. In fact, it's a set of two books. And there's, I don't know if they're still available, but were some special editions that had, denatured or dead bacterium
Sure.
slides containing the poem and so on. Can you talk just a bit about what the books are and kind of how what they contain?
Sure.
Because as you keep saying, there's two short poems. Uh, but what's the book?
Sure. Well, if it's not, simply hard enough to write these two poems and get them to be properly expressed in a unkillable bacterium, you also have to write all kinds of supporting work around it that props it up, that explains it, that provides context for it, that assists people in understanding, why somebody might go to this trouble to produce this epic outcome. And I wrote what amounts to two books of poetry. I had hoped to be able to publish the entirety of this work under a single cover, but in the course of working on the project over such a prolonged period of time, funding bodies and agencies want to see an outcome. So I, of course, had to produce work in progress. And in 2015, I published a work entitled The Xenotext, Book 1. And now in 2025, I followed up with that a sequel, The Xenotext, Book 2. So the books appear as a diptych. I look at the first book, the Xenotext Book 1, as a book that looks backward to the past, to the pastoral traditions of poetry. And for this reason, I describe it as my Orphic book. It's kind of written with Orpheus in mind. It's a book that's written in that voice, speaks to the ancient and classical traditions and contexts that inform the attempt, to write works of poetry that might outlast the life of an individual poet, right? This kind of work that would persist even in the most hellish environments, work that addresses the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice very directly. I wrote a whole series of poems that speak to that tradition, attempt to, evaluate it, assess it, in the 21st century. So it's an Orphic book that looks backwards. The subsequent edition, the one that's just come out, I regard as the Eurydicean volume, the book written in the voice of Eurydice, a book that looks forward into the future, into the deep future of the cosmos. And that book is maybe a little more terrifying, a little more apocalyptic and oracular in its overtones. If the prior book looks back to the deep time of life on Earth, back to the origins of life in the cosmos, this book looks forward in time to the ultimate outcomes of life's influence upon the development of the universe. So in this respect, it's a set of grimoires, kind of hellish novels of a sort, written in this Miltonic or Homeric tone about the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And there's a book that is Orphic in its overtones and a book that is Eurydicean in its overtones. And together they describe the project, they explain the context for it, they provide a kind of primer to genetic engineering and protein engineering. They show the results of the experiments, and they're littered with lyric poems about the experience of this work. They're written with all kinds of essayistic, works of prose poetry that showcase some of the context for it. I think there's a diverse variety of genres that are represented throughout the books, making it possible for a wide readership to appreciate it. There's something for everyone, I suppose, in these two books, but they constitute a record of the effort required.
Are you also publishing scientific research off this experiment?
Sure, there's kinds of peripheral outcomes that are extraneous. I've, of course, had to produce artworks that reflect upon some of this material. Obviously, images that showcase some of the data, paintings and other visual images. There's sculptures. I built a molecular model of the poem that the organism produces. These kinds of things have been exhibited around the world over the last 20 years as a way of promoting the project and gaining credibility for it. There's also a slide that features an actual sample of the organism for sale as a kind of memorial souvenir, produced in a limited edition of 100, available from my publisher. That was a costly thing to produce, to make actual slides that show a denatured sample of the organism, which you can own. And conceivably, if you were to take it apart, could genetically sequence it to find my poem buried within it, or if you wanted to, perhaps to derive and crystallize the protein that encipheres the other poem, you could probably derive it from that sample, if you went to the trouble to dismantle this slide. And finally, the laboratory, my most recent collaborator, the Contreras Research Lab at the University of Texas, Austin, the University of Austin in Texas, has produced a refereed journal article, which is about to be published, that features much of the data from this experiment and showcases the beneficial scientific results that have occurred as a side effect of working on this project. That'll come out soon. And that'll be, I suppose, my first scientific paper where I appear as a co-author, in which I've made a legitimately important contribution to science. So I'm proud of that achievement as well, to know that in some oblique way I've made a contribution to scientific endeavor.
What is it? What are you doing next? Like, when you've done this sort of project, like, what is the next step? Have to take over the world? Like, what you have to become Mars's first poet laureate?
Well,
what is the sort of
a copy of the Xenotext is sitting in a microchip on the InSight lander at Elysium Planitia on Mars right now. I hijacked an opportunity to send a digital payload to Mars and put the poems aboard that spacecraft. They're probably erased now from the chip. It's subject to a highly radioactive environment. And I can't imagine that they would be still enduring on the planet. But for a while, the poems were on the surface of Mars. They've hitched rides on a few space probes over the course of their development. And I've broadcast them to a nearby star via radio telescope. I've done all kinds of peripheral artworks that demonstrate, I suppose, the multifacetedness of the project. And as I said, it's ambitious in its scale and its scope. I'm trying to address potential audience that might detect the poem billions of years from now. What do I do after that? People have, of course, asked me that question a lot now. And Jonathan, I suppose the glib answer would be, well, what are you going to do?
No, but this is a very.
What are you people going to do? I mean, we would have to live now with the fact I accomplished this, right? I mean, I've already done it. I've already jumped over the high bar here. What are you going to do, right, in the wake of the Xenotext? I'd like to know. As far as that's concerned, I think I'm allowed to take a bit of a vacation if I could. I don't know what I would do next. I have other manuscripts in progress. I have a few unfinished Chevys sitting on blocks of concrete in the backyard, right? That I probably should repair and put on the road. There are other things to do, but I don't think I'm obliged. I hope to work on something quite so ambitious as the Xenotext. It was extremely miserable experience. It has truly been a devastating experience to work on it for 25 years without support. In fact, with active discouragement from peers. Many of whom I think have the personalities of people who stand on the sidelines of a marathon and boo the runners as they as they run by. I mean, it's been that bad. It's very difficult.
One time, Christian, that I ran a half marathon, I had got food poisoning the night before, and so I decided to try running a half marathon.
Sure, and how did it
train for it? Yeah, it was a miserable experience. But I managed to complete it, and because I had done the training. Now, I'll often use this as a metaphor in my classes for if you just do the training, you get the work, you can carry you through the bad times. But the thing I don't tell the students is when I was actually running that race, there are people on the sidelines cheering you on, and I was so angry that they were cheering me on, Christian, because I felt so miserable I was like, I just want these people to shut up, like, I
That's hilarious.
not to be cheered, I'm just doing it because I
Well,
had
I have to
decided to do
say,
it.
in contrast, without a few people without a few close friends, providing some emotional support, it would have been even more miserable. And in fact, of course, I had lots of friends who were discouraging me in the course of this. I mean, well-meaning friends who thought that I should just simply write about the failure of the project, give up, surrender.
I I remember not encouraging you to quit, but at one point I remember having a discussion with you and you were saying something along the lines of how you had these other books that you were working on, but you weren't going to do anything with them until the Xenotext was done. And I was like, why not just put them out earlier? Why worry about
Mm.
that? So I wasn't necessarily trying to discourage you from the project, but I think, you know, there is like, as you say, like even the well-meaning like possibility, like you pick such a hard task. Of course, it's reasonable to think you could do other things, but on a certain level, you can't. Your point was interesting. I remember, I forget exactly what you said, but you had made the point along the lines of, I can't get too invested in another project. I have to keep working on this project. It's so much requires my focus. Yeah, I can take away with that thing my free time, but I can't actually focus on what am I going to do? Tour another book? I'm supposed to be working on this one. It's already taken you so long. How did it feel when you were finally done it, and you got
Well,
the
I can be quite
vindication on
personal
certain
about that.
things?
That's a good question. I can certainly be very personal about it. Um, I got the result, the successful result in 2023 in summer. I had submitted an experiment and worked very diligently with my collaborators and technicians to refine this genetic sequence and test it out in the target organism. And it was looking very promising. The outcomes were, seemed to be leaning in the direction that we needed. I had a set of benchmarks I did. I had certain kinds of data points that I had to successfully transcend for me to be able to say I had succeeded across all of the parameters of the project. I wanted to make sure it succeeded on every one of these fronts before I'd say I had won. And I got the result, and of course, it is delivered to me via email. I open the letter, open the response, and of course, there's no fanfare. There's nothing that says "Hooray, you've succeeded!" Right? It's just the data. I'm just given this data, and I have to interpret it, and I'm proceeding to interpret it and discovering complete success across every parameter, hit all the benchmarks, and exceeded them, which was way better than I ever anticipated on a Hail Mary solution, right? To the like, it's my last chance. I've got no other resources in the repertoire here. I have no more aptitudes. I got no more skills I can bring to bear on this. This is my last hope to try it, do this thing, see what happens. And it was the one that succeeded, and it succeeded miraculously, right? And the weird thing is, of course, minor deviation from off this particular trajectory, any particular minor change to it would not have succeeded, would have failed utterly. So, managed to find precise universe, right, in which, the likes of you and I can exist, right, out of all the potential universes that could, exist. I managed to find the one that would bear fruit. Now, I got that result and, interpreted it and discovered, I had succeeded. I might have anticipated, maybe some relief or elation or euphoria, excitement, something that would testify, right, to, kind of predictable response to success. And that is not what happened. None of that happened. In fact, I had what I can only describe as a kind of post-traumatic response. I started weeping uncontrollably. I had gotten the result on a Thursday afternoon, and I could not stop weeping until Sunday afternoon. I was for 2 or 3 days absolutely fraught with distress, just weeping uncontrollably, like just completely emotionally hysterical, and not with a sense of relief or elation or ecstasy, none of that kind of response. It was more akin to the experience I think that you might have if you've been in a car and you've been driving and have narrowly avoided a car accident. You've pulled over at the side of the road. Nobody's hurt. Nobody's dead. No, property's been damaged. No cars are wrecked. But you're sitting in the vehicle, listening to the engine tick down, right? just amazed that you're not dead, right? And that feeling, it was more akin to that. It was like looking from a height down, a cliff face, thinking I've just climbed it and I didn't die. Like, how is that possible? How am I not dead? Right? How did I get through this? Right? I've narrowly avoided some immense catastrophe. It was something more akin to that, a real confrontation with mortality, and kind of a morbid response. It was not what I expected, and it took many days to recover from it. I really was distraught about it. It was a big surprise to me that I would feel this immense reaction to it, a hysterical reaction, really. Took a while to recover from it. And even now, reporting on it makes me feel uncomfortable. It's like a hard thing to kind of admit to.
It's interesting to me because it's almost a sublime reaction. Like it's that devastation that we often associate the sublime with the beauty, but it's not historically associated with beauty necessarily. It's historically associated with that absolute devastation and the
a kind of avoidance of fear,
identification or
right? Or experience of fear vicariously, right, is usually associated with the sublime. A kind of a sense of terror that you're
seeing the face of
one
God,
step removed from.
incomprehensibility.
Yeah.
So in a weird sort of way,
I think that's what it was. It was just the incomprehensible character of it, because I knew how stacked the odds were against me. Like, and it's not the elation of winning a lottery. It's sort of the elation, perhaps, of avoiding an immense catastrophe. I've avoided, right, nuclear conflict or something. It's like that kind of, like something truly, outlandish falling and didn't, right? Like something terrible could have happened and it didn't.
Well, it's I think it's a hard thing, even though you're very eloquent about explaining it all. I think it's in some respects a hard thing to talk about and understand. And I really do encourage people to get a hold of these Xenotext books. They're fascinating. Christian himself is a fantastic writer. And of course, one of the only writers who could do this, perhaps the only, and we've seen the only writer who, could do it on a certain level. They're just fantastic books. I really encourage everyone to check them out and to dig into the project. It's again, like me, I interviewed Christian in the earlier stages of the project, and people can find that interview on my website if they search for it, just The Believer, Jonathan Ball, Christian Bok. But that's, again, the early stages of the project. So it was quite advanced on some levels at that point, but there's much newer material. Darren Wershler did an essay that also details in a bit more depth, again, in the early stages of the project, sort of what the plan was and the idea. But of course, the Xenotext itself, those books are the most up-to-date renderings of this incredible artwork. I just want to, as I let you go here, Christian, I just want to congratulate you once more on completing the dream of poets. Shelley writes
Let's
about,
see it.
Ozymandias.
If the world approves, an achievement like this in this particular day and age, in this particular context, might go unremarked.
But the day and age, this day and age is but a blip in the life of the Xenotext Christian.
Right. Well,
as are you.
I'd like to be around, though, to collect the marshmallow if I'm allowed to. I don't want the fame of that bacterium to kind of outlast me. In the sense that the achievement goes unremarked. To put in 25 years of it's a lifetime commitment, right? They put people away murder for longer than that.
I'll certainly continue to remark on it, and I hope that everyone listening gets a hold of the Xenotext.
And if it inspires curiosity, and I hope it inspires other poets to be ambitious. On the one hand, I would joke that I've written the Xenotext in part to scare my friends and rivals, but on the one hand, it's also an attempt to show what poetry can do, what it can accomplish, what language is capable of making happen in the world. And I'd like to think that it's something big. It's like a moon landing. It's something epic in scale. It's on par with the Iliad. It's on par with Paradise Lost. Right? It's something giant. in
I
scope.
think it's certainly in the tradition of those works, like quite literally in their tradition,
Mhm.
but also I think in terms of its ambition and scale, I do, similarly feel like poets, writers, artists would do well to have these grand ambitions, whether they realize them or not. But of
Mhm.
course, it's always remarkable when they realize them. And the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants and how the art moves forward, that idea has come into science and has
Mhm.
been part integral to science in recent decades. That idea was once integral in the arts, and we've sort of lost some focus on it. And I feel like the restoration of this notion that we could work inside of a tradition, but not be beholden to it. We can advance the art collaboratively,
Sure.
um, but also in
Well, and
competition with
there's
one
also,
another.
I think, too, among poets, a notion that failure is presupposed, and laudable, right? That you can apologize for it or forgive
Yes.
it or find a favor with it. And it's the story of Orpheus, right? Of course, he does an ambitious thing. I'm going to bring my loved one back to life. I'm actually going to go to hell and rescue the dead lover, and fails, right? And of course, does that failure over and over again, historically. I'd like to think that with the Xenotext, I've done that Orphic enterprise, but managed, at least for a little while, to drag Eurydice into the light. That I'm not Orpheus who failed, that I'm actually the Orpheus that did go to hell and did come back, fruitfully.
We should talk about that at another time. I have an unwritten book in me about how failure is, in postmodernism, elevated to the status of literary value
Sure.
for good and ill
Sure.
purposes. And as I think there's, a lot to be said in there, but I do appreciate one, the project, but two, that sort of determination, I think, to work on a ambitious project. It is something that I think in and of itself is sort of interesting and remarkable and laudable. And I wish was more common, frankly.
Sure.
But thanks again, Christian, for talking. Let's talk again in more depth about Xenotext and look at the poems a bit more fully another day. But for now, everyone get a hold of Xenotext, book one and book two. As the Christian says, they really are a diptych. And some of those poems in those books, outside of the Xenotext and the project, some of just the poems in the book, particularly the bee colony, colony
Mhm.
collapse disorder, and some of these other poems that you've written over the years, I think are some of your finest works in and outside of the Xenotext.
Yeah, I'm
Really
proud of
fantastic
many of
works
those
in and of
those
themselves.
works. Yeah, the colony collapse disorder, I'm very proud of. It's a translation of Virgil. I'm very pleased with that.
Yes.
Yeah, we, I wish I could write that as well as that all the time.
Well, now you have to.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thanks again for talking to me, Christian. And
Thank you, Jonathan,
right,
for allowing me to explain the project. I'm grateful for the indulgences of your listenership. I hope that they appreciate the merits of the work should they go out and test it. Thanks a lot.
I hope so too. And of course, no, never has it been truer, this sign off of mine to say, keep writing the wrong way.
Sure.
Right. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you.